Please help me in giving a warm welcome to Assistant Secretary Redl.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate the welcome. It's great to be here in Los Angeles among so many friends and colleagues and so many familiar faces here in the audience. As many of you know, and as Scott highlighted in the introduction, a great deal of my professional experience has been focused on spectrum and wireless issues, so I welcome the opportunity to be here with you today to talk about what we're doing at NTIA and within the Trump administration to support innovation in the wireless industry. Our view of the next 5 years is simple. America must win the race to 5G. This goal is simply not negotiable. While no one can predict all that 5G will unleash, we know the parameters of what can be enabled if we get it right. Tremendous boosts in capacity, download speeds that are faster than we've seen yet, seamless connectivity, and ultra-low latency communications means the opportunity for new applications that are really limited at this point only by our imaginations. Deploying robust and secure 5G networks across the country will be a big step toward life-changing and life-saving advances from smart communities to the Internet of Things. This administration is putting policies in place to ensure America's continued leadership in technology and communications. At the Department of Commerce, we're setting the stage for a 5G world. We're making critical spectrum policy decisions, and we're working to help make networks more secure and resilient against cyber attacks. With its partner, AT&T, FirstNet is building the first ever public safety broadband network, fulfilling one of the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission report. Among countless other activities, Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross is taking steps to ensure the United States is at the forefront of space technologies, with a revamped Office of Space Commerce. And we're beginning the process to build principles for data privacy model that protects innovation and consumers. American leadership has been at the core of the Trump administration's approach to policy, and our wireless industry is demonstrating that leadership in 5G will present an economic boom and the next generation of innovation that we've come to expect. But the competition will be intense, and it's critical that our policies help unleash the industry's competitive spirit more than ever. If this conference is any guide, we're right on track. All the major providers are moving forward with plans to deploy networks, obtain 5G device deals, and move from testing to launch in the next year or 18 months. And as we've seen from multinational companies like Ericsson, Nokia, and Samsung, manufacturers are looking to produce 5G equipment and increasingly to do so right here in the United States. Among NTIA's highest priorities is supporting the wireless industry's preparations for the deployment of these 5G networks and services. The Trump administration is taking a comprehensive approach to help make this leadership a reality. First, we must make enough spectrum available to meet the industry's needs. NTIA is working with the FCC across multiple fronts to make more spectrum available. These efforts will be ongoing because we know that the industry will continue to demand more to meet Americans' broadband needs. Second, we're performing the needed research, development, testing, and evaluation that will expand spectrum sharing opportunities and increase the efficient use of spectrum. Third, we're working to remove obstacles to the deployment of wireless networks and other broadband infrastructure. Fourth, we're collaborating wherever possible on the global standards that are defining 5G technologies and continue U.S. government preparations for key upcoming conferences at the International Telecommunications Union. And finally, we'll work with industry to make sure 5G networks are secure. We'll get nowhere toward our shared vision of 5G leadership if the connections are not secure. The first step, then, to unlocking the promise of 5G is to ensure sufficient access to spectrum, something this group should be very familiar with. The days of quick fixes and easy-to-identify bands and solutions to spectrum access, frankly, are behind us. We also need to maintain a balance between the spectrum needs of our growing advanced commercial wireless industries with those of the federal agencies we ask to perform their critical missions, which includes some of the most sophisticated uses of spectrum that we take advantage of every day. NTIA is coordinating with the FCC, our other federal agency partners, and the industry to repurpose federal spectrum for commercial use wherever it's feasible to do so. We're always searching for new bands to study and trying to implement sharing approaches that will make spectrum more efficient. We hear the call to have a mix of low, mid, and millimeter wave spectrum resources available for 5G, as well as for ongoing 4G services and other broadband wireless needs. Congress is playing a pivotal role by enacting legislation to enable the government to systematically analyze, study, and prepare further bans for repurposing, either through reallocation or sharing. The Spectrum Pipeline Act of 2015 required NTIA to work towards repurposing 30 megahertz of spectrum below 3 gigahertz, and it also established a mechanism for federal agencies to tap into the Spectrum Relocation Fund to explore innovative operational and spectrum use changes likely to free up federal spectrum for commercial use. 3 so-called pipeline plans have been submitted so far. 2 have already been approved and are in progress and being funded. The Spectrum Efficient National Surveillance Radar, or SENSOR program, which is being led by the Federal Aviation Administration and has received more than $70 million in funding so far from the SRF to help make it a reality. And NOAA is studying its weather data distribution activities to potentially enable spectrum sharing in 1675 to 1680, where it operates meteorological satellites. DoD is leading the remaining pipeline activity, and they've submitted a proposal to improve access in 1300 to 1350 by considering operations and options for their systems that are not included in the SENSOR program. In the coming weeks, we also expect DoD to submit an additional plan related to the 3450 to 3550 megahertz band, which NTIA previously announced as a candidate for examination for reallocation. Earlier this year, as part of the budget legislation, Congress passed Ray Baum's Act, which was included the Mobile Now Act, and kicked off a wide range of efforts at NTIA and at the FCC to explore further avenues to making spectrum available. The Mobile Now Act requires us, in coordination with the Commission, to identify 255 megahertz of spectrum below 8 gigahertz for licensed and unlicensed mobile and fixed broadband services. NTIA must also submit a report within 2 years on the feasibility of allowing commercial wireless services to share 3100 to 3550 with federal incumbents. And we're required to deliver recommendations on the potential incentives for federal agencies to share more spectrum. NTIA is also working with the FCC on the reports Mobile Now has mandated. This includes assessing the feasibility of making frequencies in 3.7 to 4.2 available for flexible use and completing a study on what is sometimes referred to as bidirectional sharing. It means exploring new opportunities for federal users to gain shared access to some non-federal bands. It stands to reason that it could work best in cases where generally compatible systems or equipment are being used by both federal and non-federal users, or in bands that lend themselves to geographic separation. The solutions we need to continue and pursue are dependent on strong capabilities in research, development, testing, and evaluation. Fortunately, NTIA has a lot to bring to the table in terms of our engineering and scientific expertise in our offices of spectrum management and the Institute for Telecommunications Sciences in Boulder, Colorado. They've led to innovative spectrum management tools and techniques, and our collaborative efforts with our federal agency partners means we typically have even more expertise at the table. As an example, take the engineering work we're doing in the CBRS band to make federal radars in 3550 and 3650 work with commercial uses. As part of the FCC's tiered architecture for spectrum access in this band, NTIA has invested significant resources and engineering expertise in collaboration with the Commission and the Wireless Innovation Forum to develop the standards for testing and certification of spectrum access system and environmental sensing capability equipment. NTIA's engineers have also worked to develop the concept of dynamic protection areas, or DPAs, in which both commercial wireless and federal radars can coexist on a dynamic basis. The DPAs will allow us to move beyond static geographic coverage areas and exclusion zones that protect radars, which is essentially the regulatory sledgehammer that would have undercut the viability of CBRS as a national service in 3.5. As a result, and as you're hearing from many speakers this week, we're on the brink of CBRS becoming a commercial reality, an exciting development that we've all been eagerly anticipating. And our spectrum work is not the only way NTIA is helping to foster growth across the entire wireless ecosystem. The administration has prioritized efforts to spur investment in broadband infrastructure. NTIA is working to improve federal coordination around this effort through an interagency working group that we co-chair with our colleagues at the Department of Agriculture. The group is focusing in 3 core areas: streamlining federal permitting, leveraging federal assets for broadband, and coordinating federal funding of broadband projects. Congress weighed in here as well, as they are known to do. Mobile Now included sections crafted to promote easier siting of communications facilities on federal lands. And Congress also directed NTIA to improve the national broadband map, looking to address concerns about gaps in broadband availability, particularly in rural areas. At the beginning of the summer, NTIA asked for comments from the public on ways to increase the quality and the accuracy of broadband availability data. We received 53 sets of comments indicating a variety of data sources and approaches that we can use to spur this effort. We appreciate the thoughtful comments, particularly from a number of folks who are here in this room who shared their experience and their ideas on ways that we can improve the map. This fall, NTIA's broadband team will begin acquiring the tools necessary to begin the data collection we need. We're looking to partner with industry and government agencies in new ways in order to achieve these goals. And we hope to create a scalable platform and a phased approach to a new national broadband map to make the most of our resources. Elsewhere on the infrastructure front, I want to update you briefly on the status of FirstNet. Under the watchful eye of the First Responder Network Authority, AT&T continues to build out the public safety broadband network. Since the beginning of the year, AT&T has deployed an initial 1,000 sites, plus mobile cell sites, and has signed up more than 2,500 public safety agencies. More than 150,000 devices are now using FirstNet services, and there are more than 20 mobile applications available to subscribers in the FirstNet app catalog. We're excited about the progress we've made, and we're confident that when public safety looks at what we're offering, they'll like what they see. Of course, we also have to keep an eye on the international scene. NTIA spends a lot of its time working to make sure we're coordinating U.S. efforts and presenting the U.S. vision to the world. There are 2 major ITU conferences coming up in the next 14 months, and we are deep in preparations for both of them. At the end of October, the ITU's Plenipotentiary Conference will convene in Dubai. The conference will set the course for the union's priorities and activities, including its overall leadership for the next 4 years. A year later, the World Radio Communication Conference will be held in Egypt. Among other items on the agenda, the work will be looking at global allocations for broadband wireless services in the millimeter wave bands, providing an international scope for the growing 5G ecosystem. I know that GSMA and CTIA are both active in these ITU conferences, and I expect that many of you attending this conference are working hard for your organizations or even as part of your national delegations to achieve goals that will allow the growth of terrestrial 5G, satellite, and other broadband services around the world. As part of that, I'd like to encourage you, as the Plenipot approaches rapidly, to support Doreen Bogdan-Martin as the director of the Telecommunication Development Bureau, the D sector of the ITU. Doreen is an American, but she's also an international civil servant, and she's dedicated her career to increasing the availability of people all around the world to connect to the internet, access valuable telemedicine, educational, and business opportunities. She's immensely qualified to serve as the head of the ITUD, and her election will be a clear sign to the ITU that they will support women for well-deserved leadership roles at its highest level. To close, I want to stress how important security will be in all that we do going forward. For example, President Trump has made clear that securing 5G networks is a prominent national security issue. As a government, we're vitally interested in standard setting and other activities that are designed to ensure the integrity of U.S. wireless networks. It's also crucial for the government to be confident that supply chains are protected as much as possible from software and device vulnerabilities. At the Department of Commerce, we've made major progress in the last 2 years on security issues related to the Internet of Things. Specifically, we've taken on the threat of botnets, a major issue facing the world because of the sheer number of insecure devices that exist. Earlier this year, the Departments of Commerce and Homeland Security delivered a report to the President on how to improve the resilience of the Internet and reduce the threat of botnets. The report emphasized this is an ecosystem-wide problem, and no one industry or technology can single-handedly change our exposure to evolving risks. The emergence of connected devices with limited security is flagged as one of those major risks. The departments are now working on a draft roadmap of actions that the government and private stakeholders can take to make our networks more secure. The suggested steps, if taken up, would improve the security of the overall Internet ecosystem. We've also stressed the importance of multi-stakeholder action to promote the security of connected devices. Last year, we convened a collaborative effort between IoT manufacturers, security experts, and other IoT stakeholders that produced recommendations and guidance on how to make sure that connected devices were patchable. We recently launched a new multi-stakeholder process focused on the transparency of software components, based on the idea that you have to know any vulnerable components in your connected products if you want to keep them secure. This initiative has attracted experts from across the digital ecosystem as we try to avoid solutions that are targeted at only one market. Stakeholders have produced interesting work into valuable work streams addressing both technology and policy aspects of this issue. We'll be hosting a virtual meeting on this issue in the coming weeks and an in-person meeting in Washington, D.C. on November 6th for participants to share their progress. Of course, security is only one part of the equation as we look to usher in an even more connected world. We've also seen national conversation around the issue of data privacy. At the direction of the White House, the Department of Commerce has launched a process to reassert American leadership in consumer data privacy. At NTIA, we've been holding discussions with various stakeholders to find areas of agreement and a possible path forward. In the next few weeks, we'll be issuing a request for comment to gather further feedback on our proposed approach. Our hope for this process is a result that will provide legal clarity, flexibility to innovate, and high levels of consumer protection. We have a strong track record of privacy protections in this country. Now is not the time to sit back and allow bad ideas to flourish. Under American leadership, business and consumers will be able to act with confidence and certainty. I think it's clear from what you're seeing and experiencing here this week that when we talk about 5G, we're talking about no less than the future of the internet and how it will shape our lives for decades to come. It's also clear that a wide range of policy decisions and actions will play important roles. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the competition for global 5G leadership will be fierce. But in my time at NTIA, in my meetings with engineers and executives, and now at this conference, I've seen the evidence that collectively we have what it takes to get the job done. My door is always open. And I know you love talking about these issues as much as I do, since I know a lot of you here in this room. Let's keep working together. Let's keep the United States in its rightful place as the leader in innovation and as a leader in wireless technology. Thanks for having me here.
As I speak, my patent attorney is...
I think they're asking me to take a couple questions, but no one else is speaking up. So I'm happy to take a couple questions if anyone has anyone they'd like to ask. If I run before Paul gets to the mic, do I get off the hook?
Paul Kirby with TR Daily. You
Hi,
said
Paul.
in a recent speech that you're waiting for guidance from the White House on the spectrum strategy. Is that going to come from OSDP, the Domestic Council, the Economic Council, a tweet?
Bait offered, bait not taken. I mean, not surprisingly, we're working with all the components of the White House and across the administration as we look at this. And I think you'll hopefully be hearing, I believe Kelsey Geiselman from OSTP is here to represent the White House and is speaking on a panel tomorrow. I think she will probably be able to give you a little more clarity about the White House's thinking. But not surprisingly, NTIA, given our role in spectrum policy, has spent a lot of time thinking about this and working on this, and we're looking forward to working with the White House to get something out the door.
What's the timing specifically as far as getting something out the door?
Oh, come on, Paul.
Why don't you just have everyone leave and you can just tell me? or you could tweet it.
Anybody else, or am I getting off easy? All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
All right, thanks, Krista, and welcome to LA, everybody, in our very first policy panel that has a Hill panel. We are very excited to do this year, excited to be here in Los Angeles to discuss several important legislative initiatives before Congress today. I especially want to thank our panelists for taking time out of their very busy schedules to share their insights. They are truly key players on Capitol Hill. So let me briefly introduce them, and then we'll hear what they are working on and their views on several important policy topics before Congress. So to my left is Crystal Tully. She is the Policy Director and Counsel for the Senate Commerce Committee under Chairman John Thune. To her left is Eric Einhorn, Senior Counsel for Technology and Communications Policy for Senator Schatz. Sean Farrell, Professional Staff Member, House Energy and Commerce Committee. And Alex Damato, Senior Technology and Telecommunications Policy Advisor for Congresswoman Doris Matsui. So we've been here today. We've heard a lot about 5G and, of course, the global race to 5G. You have all had the opportunity to visit some of the exhibits here and see what 5G wireless innovation will soon bring to market. Some very exciting stuff. Hopefully you've also noticed the U.S. wireless industry's commitment to win the global race to 5G, which will mean significant investment and jobs here in the U.S. What role do you see Congress playing to ensure we maintain our global leadership in wireless, especially, of course, with respect to 5G? So I'd love to hear everyone's take on that, since obviously that's what we're here today for. So.
I guess I'll start. Thanks, Jaime, and to CTIA and Mobile World Congress for having us here. Pleasure to be here today, and I guess out of DC and away from maybe some of the weather that we're going to get there later this week. So I guess the role I see and what we've been working on in the Commerce Committee in the Senate is kind of similar to the way Chairman Pai views the future of 5G, kind of three pillars: technology, which is what we saw today, some of the amazing things we saw here today. You guys are all doing that. Spectrum availability and infrastructure. So with regard to spectrum, we've been looking at lots of ways to free up more of it. We held a hearing in July, and we had CTIA was there, Meredith was there to testify on ways to free up more spectrum. So we're continuing to look at that. Some of my panelists here also have bills aimed at doing that, and we also are looking at infrastructure, which is my boss's kind of number one priority in this space. We actually had a small town in South Dakota come to us, more than a year ago now, and a small wireless carrier there and a university wanted service from the wireless carrier, and in order to site, they were going through all this red tape and jumping through all these hoops, and in South Dakota, you really only have 6 months to site because of the cold weather, frozen ground, and all of that. So they came to us and said, how can we figure out how to speed this up? And so over the past year and a half, we've been meeting with all of you and stakeholders from state and local groups and trying to figure out a way that we can speed up deployment on state and local lands after we kind of dealt with the federal lands through Mobile Now. So really, we introduced, Eric and I introduced the bill, Senator Thune and Senator Schatz's bill to streamline small cell deployment in June, and we hope to continue moving that bill forward.
Great, thank you. So Eric, that was a good segue.
Yeah. I think Congress will have an important role here, and I think about the three sort of functions of Congress, or at least the three of them: oversight, appropriations, and legislation. And I think Crystal touched on legislation, and there are probably other things that we'll need to do. I think oversight might be one of the more important areas here. Spectrum is obviously really important, infrastructure, universal service too, and all those things are issues that the FCC and NTIA are dealing a lot with, and Congress's role in overseeing that process, sort of sometimes throwing some sand in the gear, sometimes cajoling and pushing is helpful for the process, but ultimately these can be really technical issues, and I think it's important to have the expert agency very hands-on and involved. It's often hard to legislate or push through the appropriations process with highly technical issues unless you're sort of targeted or big picture. So that's, I think, probably the best role for Congress in these issues.
I agree with everything that my fellow panelists have said. Back in November of last year, the Energy and Commerce Committee held a hearing entitled The Race to 5G and Its Potential to Revolutionize American Competitiveness. And I think I've heard a lot, both in the demonstrations we've seen here, as well as panelists up here in the previous panels have really spoken to the revolutionary capability of 5G technology. And, I completely concur with Crystal and what she said of kind of the three-legged stool, which we explored at our hearing. The need for densification of the network, which will require small cells and siting reform at the federal, state, and local level to help advance that. You need harmonization of standards, both through ITU and the standard-setting organizations like 3GPP. And then lastly, and most importantly, we need spectrum availability to make it all possible.
Yeah, one of the best things about going last is you can say you associate yourself with all your colleagues' comments, which I certainly do. I think that's important. I think kind of from my lens and my role, one of the most important things is obviously spectrum availability. We've talked a lot about today about how the FCC is moving forward with auctions 101 and 102, doing yeoman's work getting high-band spectrum into the marketplace. I think a lot of what Congress is focused on and working with the FCC and the NTIA is really pushing forward to find the right policy tools and the right mix to get a lot of mid-band spectrum into the marketplace. There's, about 1,000 megahertz between 3.4 and 4.4, combinations of which, or portions of which, could potentially be made available for commercial mobile broadband. So figuring out kind of where the fault lines are, the new tools that we can, to either share or reallocate portions of that spectrum, I think will be important. I think some of us obviously have engaged on legislation on the matter, and I think it's a goal that we all support.
Great. So I think all of you mentioned the importance of infrastructure. Obviously, both spectrum, and infrastructure are important, but I want to focus on infrastructure for a minute, particularly since you guys mentioned the bill that Chairman Thune and Senator Schatz introduced pretty recently. The traditional 200-foot macro towers are now being replaced by small cells that are much smaller and can be placed on existing infrastructure, like streetlights or buildings. Of course, we saw some of these earlier today. As you guys mentioned, Chairman Thune and Senator Schatz recently introduced the Streamlined Small Cell Deployment Act, which will help ensure critical 5G infrastructure is deployed in a timely manner while preserving local zoning authority. Crystal and Eric, can you talk a little bit about this legislation and what your bosses hope to achieve by introducing it?
You can go first if you want.
Ladies first.
Okay. I already kind of touched on the reason why we started exploring this in the first place, but really as we opened that door and we started to have more folks come in and talk about the problems that they were seeing in their own states and cities, and we kind of thought this was a good way to go. It's really building on the Mobile Now Act that I mentioned earlier that dealt with siting on federal lands, so this would be state and local. And I think really putting the bill out there was a big step, kind of opened the discussion for feedback from local stakeholders. We're really trying to continue that process and really move it forward. And the FCC I think is also doing great work that's complementary to what we're doing to really kind of push forward in 5G.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. My boss is really interested in the issue and making sure that there are opportunities sort of on both sides for some balance. And is really, since we've introduced the bill, we've been working hard, I'd say jointly, to get that feedback from all different stakeholders. And, and I'd say my boss is interested in figuring out if there are places where we need to tweak the bill or improve it, or opportunities to improve it. Crystal mentioned the interplay with the bill and alluded to the FCC, or talked about the FCC, and obviously the FCC, as many of you know, is considering considering a rule the end of this month on the 26th, and there's a lot of overlap between the two, and I think there's important interplay between the two. So it'll be interesting to see how that process plays out.
One more thing to note too, we've had so many local folks come in and say, how do we get 5G to our community faster? So there really is a lot of collaboration and excitement to move things forward. So what we're really doing here is just trying to set some guardrails.
Right. Well, just a quick follow-up for you two on that, because you both mentioned that the FCC, obviously, and we've heard about that today too, and it's nice, obviously, when Congress and the administration and independent agencies are rowing in the same direction. But there is some overlap for sure, but there's a few differences as well. So can you guys talk a little bit more? We've heard from our members that it only takes about an hour to install a small cell on a streetlight or a utility pole, but under the current rules, it can take more than a year to get the necessary permits. So can you guys talk a little bit more about the importance of just having a predictable and speedy timeline as well as a meaningful enforcement mechanism?
Yeah, I mean, it is important. As I mentioned before, in South Dakota, you have a very limited time frame in general to cite. So having shot clocks in place to kind of move the process forward faster, and then also kind of having that backstop with deemed granted, so you really can move the process forward faster is, I think, incredibly important to getting things started and keeping up with some of the other nations that are moving a lot faster and getting spectrum to market, and citing small cells and other smaller technology.
Right.
Yeah, and clearly in a very capital-intensive business with a long timeline, which sort of what defines network deployment, certainty, and having a good set of rules that allow you to operate and deploy is very important. One thing, just to add on to what Crystal said, to note, when we were working on the bill, one thing that was sort of front and foremost as we were thinking through the process from the working draft to the bill that we introduced was the structure under 332 for macro towers and sort of the mismatch there with small cells. And what we did was we essentially carved out a spot for small cells, defined by size small cells, and then gave a different set of parameters for that. So sort of recognition that macro towers are important, will continue to be important, but small cells, for the reasons that Jaime described, are maybe a different animal.
Yeah, it's just sort of an updated guidance because of the new technology.
Yeah.
Sean and Alex, staying on infrastructure, obviously the Energy and Commerce Committee has worked on reforming the federal siting rules. Is there any interest in modernizing the local siting rules as well?
Well, so we're definitely very interested in tracking everything that's going on. On the one hand, we've got Chairman Thune and Ranking Member Schatz of the subcommittee with their Streamline Act, which is very interesting. It's creating a lot of dialogue and discussion, which is great to track. The action at the commission, which we anticipate at the end of the month, the vote on that, is going to be very good. And I think one thing that really stands out in all this is the bipartisan aspect of it. We've got Thune and Schatz, Republican and Democrat, working together on this bill and moving it forward. I think for a lot of you folks, you probably watch news and think nothing in Washington ever happens or gets done, and there's just endless partisanship. In communications, I think it's good to note that we actually get a lot done. I think this is a good example of it. And it builds on a lot of success we've already had this year. As part of the Omnibus Appropriations Bill, we passed one of the most significant telecommunications bills in the last 8 years, which reauthorized the Federal Communications Commission for the first time in 25 years. So I think that really just stands out in my mind.
Yeah. Alex?
Yeah, I certainly agree with a lot of that. I think an interesting lens, which is certainly kind of a different aspect of a similar issue, and to ensure I bore everybody to sleep before I get to my actual answer, I'll cite, I think a 2016 report that USDA put out. They looked at a little bit over 300 different projects that were funded under BIP. Some mixed, tens of towers, tens of thousands of lines of fiber. But one of the important things that they found was not a single one of those projects had any sort of adverse impact. It's an important lens to kind of make sure, regardless of what aspect we're talking about, whether we're talking about federal issues, state and local issues, respect the nature and the impact of broadband projects and that they generally have. To answer the specific question, I certainly give Crystal and Eric a ton of credit for the extremely strong bipartisan product that they were able to put out. It does a lot of good work is advancing the deployment of infrastructure, leaving room certainly for state and local officials to review projects ranging from anywhere public safety to aesthetic concerns. And we certainly look forward to working with all of our partners.
Great, thank you. Let's turn to spectrum. You've all mentioned it, and obviously it is equally important in winning the global race to 5G. And you've also mentioned the Mobile Now Act, which was signed into law earlier this year, and I want to congratulate and thank all of you for your hard work in getting that across the finish line. It was a huge accomplishment. As you all know, though, it was supposed to be an important down payment for future spectrum auctions, which will be vital for 5G. We know that other nations are moving aggressively to make more spectrum available. The FCC is also taking a hard look, and of course we have the Airwaves Act and the Spectrum Now Act that have been introduced this Congress. So first, what are your thoughts on the importance of a long-term spectrum plan or auction schedule? As you know, in DC, it's hard to do anything without deadlines, to provide the certainty companies need to invest in 5G services and deployment. I'll just open it up to whoever wants to take.
I mean, I'll jump in.
Okay.
I think a plan is really important. In fact, I think it's required now by law. And my boss in particular has been focused on having both licensed and licensed as part of that. Unlicensed is also an important component for 5G, or will be an important component for 5G. So I know from my office, at least from our office, that we're focused on both, and do think that having a plan for that and sort of marching through that plan in an orderly way will be really important.
Great. Anyone else?
Yeah, no, I would say that this morning my boss, Representatives Guthrie and FCC Commissioners O'Reilly and Rosenworcel all penned an op-ed together talking about the importance of 5G and the important work getting some of the C-band spectrum to market. It discusses a lot of the importance and complementarity of licensed and unlicensed. The ecosystem benefits the most when you have kind of robust access to both. So I think certainly it's an important issue, and we can talk about the Spectrum Now Act whenever you want.
Perfect segue, actually. That was my next question. So Eric and Alex, you guys worked together and your bosses introduced bipartisan, bicameral, the Spectrum Now Act, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about that and how it will further efforts to ensure spectrum efficiency, particularly, of course, for the federal government, and make more available for commercial use.
I'll let you start.
Happy to. Fair enough. I think Assistant Secretary Redl talked a lot about it before, but the Pipeline Act of 2015 created a process for federal agencies to come together and apply for research and development funding to look at activities that they could undertake to become more spectrally efficient and potentially reallocate some of their spectrum for commercial use. That process certainly worked well. It's currently funding the sensor study, the non-DoD sensor portion of that. But that kind of the initial allocation that the Pipeline Act created has actually kind of already been expended. So the really important role that the Spectrum Now Act can play is, it comes to bear with the NTIA and DoD having already identified 100 megahertz and the 3.4 band for potential commercial use. But without the Spectrum Now Act, even if they kind of came together, submitted a Pipeline Act plan, there would actually be no funding availability for that. So one of the kind of significant fixes that the Spectrum Now Act would bring immediately is ensuring that when we're ready to start the hard work of figuring out how we're actually going to bring that 100 megahertz to market, that there is money to do all of the R&D, the field testing, everything that goes into reallocating some spectrum. So that is, I think, one of the most important things, and hopefully it will kind of continue to fund more projects in the future.
Yep. Like I said before, Senator Schatz is really interested in making sure that we have enough spectrum, unlicensed and licensed, and he thought that this was a very creative way to continue to sort of bring more forces to bear, I guess, more tools into the toolbox. He is very interested in sort of all the benefits that more spectrum can bring, and is supportive of lots of different ways to address that.
Great. Well, I know, obviously we're very supportive of any efforts to ensure that this valuable public resource is being used efficiently and being put to its highest and best use. Let's talk about rural broadband, because you can't really talk about any of this without talking about, start making sure we're connecting everyone. Congress has obviously made it a priority to encourage and support affordable broadband access for all Americans, and there are obviously still areas of the country that remain unserved for various reasons. One creative idea that has been floated and is included in the Airwaves Act is a rural dividend emanating from spectrum auctions. The idea is to set aside 10% of the proceeds of spectrum auctions and use that for rural build-out. If this dividend was in place for the last 2 auctions, over $6 billion would be newly available for rural deployment. That's more than the entire FCC Mobility Fund will make available over the next decade. So would love to hear your thoughts on this idea and how this additional funding can help expedite broadband deployment in rural communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting idea, definitely something to talk about. I think all of the members we work for, whether you're state or district, know where all the spots are, where there's little to no service. And it's a topic that comes up repeatedly at hearings we have. It's something that's very important to all of the members on our committee. So getting more money out into rural areas to kind of close that digital divide is very important. This is a very novel approach to that, and I think it definitely warrants further discussion.
Great.
In the House Energy and Commerce Committee, this is an important issue for us, the Rural Broadband Challenge. We actually held a hearing on rural broadband and the challenges to ubiquitous broadband in rural areas in July. And I think, much like we need every tool in the toolbox when it comes to making more spectrum available, we also need to evaluate every tool in the toolbox getting more rural broadband.
Yeah, we like to say a lot that comparable services is, more than just a talking point. It's a mandate of federal law, Section 254 of the Communications Act. I think one of the interesting facets, one of the interesting conversations around rural broadband looking forward, I think will definitely surround the Remote Areas Fund, which I know how much everybody loves USF. But, we had about $1.5 billion of it is going to the reverse auction. Saw kind of robust provider participation using different technologies. I think kind of as we push forward to the Remote Areas Fund, it's truly intended to reach the highest cost, hardest to serve areas. A lot of those areas still don't have a viable broadband option. So, the policy discussion surrounding that is still kind of a bit in its infancy. But, I'd certainly be interested in seeing how we can get more participation from mobile wireless, for instance. So I think that's important.
So if I could just quickly add, without repeating everyone, it is an interesting idea and I think worth considering. But I think if my boss were here, he would also just want to add that we need to be thinking about and fixing the contribution methodology, which isn't just focused on rural, it's all the funding for universal service. We've shifted the fund, the FCC has shifted the fund from legacy telecom services to broadband. And on the contribution side, we have a total mismatch. The funding is not based upon broadband services, it's based upon legacy telecom services. And that's not sustainable, and we can either sort of wait for the emergency to happen or we can get ahead of it. We're already at 20% for the contribution factor for the first time this quarter, and it's an increasingly accelerating problem.
Thank you. So I want to talk about the IoT, because obviously on the show floor you see lots of exciting applications and all sorts of demos we were able to see today that kind of show the potential for the IoT. So obviously 5G is going to revolutionize the Internet of Things, from wearables to automated vehicles, remote surgery, augmented reality, and beyond. Today, healthcare costs are among the largest expenditures for states. I understand telehealth is an important policy focus for many of your bosses. We know innovation in this space could save billions of dollars, but more importantly, lives. Eric, and maybe I'll start with you. I know Senator Schatz has been very involved in this. Can you discuss a little bit about your work on this issue and how you see 5G impacting the Internet of Things?
Yeah, sure. So Senator Schatz is very passionate about telehealth. I'd say it's one of his top issues that he's most interested in. He was the author of a bill, I'm looking at the name because I always forget it, the Connect for Health Act of 2017, which was a bipartisan law that passed, and Senator Wicker was the co-sponsor with that, and they worked together on it in a bipartisan way. It was very successful and enabled Medicaid reimbursement for telehealth, and I think it leveled the playing field for other services. Telehealth expands access to care, it lowers costs, it helps more people still stay healthy. It's a great bipartisan issue because the Democrats like it because it expands health care and it helps people, and Republicans like all that, and I think like that it saves money too. I think 5G is a great, will be a really promising improvement for applications that need, obviously latency and certainty, and the expanded bandwidth that 5G will bring, I think will be really built well for applications in healthcare, and who knows what the future will hold, but I think there's a lot of promise there.
Great. Anyone else want to?
Yeah, the rural broadband hearing that I mentioned that we had in July, Chairman Walden had one of his constituents, Jenny Ward. She's a registered nurse from Walla Walla County, Oregon. She came and testified, and if you have the opportunity, you should go to our website and look at her testimony, because she actually talks about the real life-saving applications that 5G will bring and its benefits, particularly to rural communities. To that point, rural healthcare is extremely important to Chairman Walden. He worked directly with Chairman Pai to get, I believe, a 43% increase in the rural health care program this year, upping it to a total of roughly $571 million, which is a pretty big accomplishment. He's very proud of that.
Yeah, I'm going to tie it all together. I'm going to do rural broadband, healthcare, and IoT. One of the things that my boss has been really interested in talking about more, and one of the things that we've seen a lot today, is narrowband IoT networks. Multiple carriers are kind of seeking to deploy them. One of the really kind of interesting things is that it can live, within or beyond the LTE construct. It can be deployed on really narrow slivers of spectrum and guard bands. So it's incredibly efficient from a spectrum perspective, but it also kind of, with that, kind of requires less processing power. It propagates better in indoor, underground, rural areas. So it's both kind of a nationwide strategy, but it's also good for rural, and deployment costs similarly go down because of all of that. So it can enable things like remote monitoring, get your healthcare, rural broadband tied in there, and a little IoT. So.
Great. So we've talked about a lot, we've covered a lot. You guys are very busy, obviously. But I wanted to talk a little bit, as we are approaching the end of this Congress, I wanted to talk about what's coming up next. And, outside of the issues that we have discussed, are there other communications issues you see on the horizon that may come up next Congress, may dominate next Congress? What issues are your bosses and policymakers in general concerned about that, we may not yet have on our radar, or that we just haven't discussed yet?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to look at kind of the state of the media landscape, and the way that we're consuming video and content is just much different than it used to be. It continues to change with the expiration of the Satellite Authorization Act at the end of 2019. I'm sure that'll become more of a focus for us next year.
Great. Eric?
Well, privacy obviously is something that will be important in the near future. I'd say maybe one that's not so much on the radar, but I think is important, is thinking about the impact of consolidation on competition and how that interplays with sort of the current regulatory environment, regulatory structure, and what that needs to look like going forward if we continue to have the same sorts of trends.
I think cybersecurity will continue to be a major issue that Energy and Commerce and Senate Commerce will have to be dealing with going forward. From our perspective, there's a lot of really great work being done on the cybersecurity and the supply chain vulnerability front through, entities like the Department of Homeland Security. But we think it's important that the Department of Commerce in general and NTIA in particular, given their knowledge and their technical expertise, have a better seat at the table when it comes to these issues.
Yeah, I'll stick with one of our themes today, which is spectrum. I think something my boss is interested in, that's obviously been a growing part of the conversation, is federal spectrum leasing. I know that that kind of comes with a big bag, but I think that there are kind of a lot of opportunities that we could potentially look at to, deployment scenarios where it could be kind of the end of the life cycle of a system. Whatever the case may be, there might be, an opportunity where it could be inappropriate to kind of reallocate or have some sort of shared licensing framework, certainly in the near term. But there could be an opportunity for, some sort of commercial lease. It's tricky both on the government side and on the industry side. So it's a complex policy framework. Certainly one that my boss is interested in exploring, seeing if we can get right. So I think that might be coming up.
Great, thank you. Now we all know what we're going to be busy working on next Congress. All right, let's turn to a few fun questions. Do you remember what your first cell phone was?
I guess this dates all of us.
It does, sorry.
Well, I had a Sprint Qualcomm PCS. I forget the number, but it was a big brick. It had the antenna you had to pull out. It's funny because at the time I was probably 14 or 15, and I didn't want a cell phone. I wanted a pager because everyone had a pager, and that was cool. And my father's like, no, there's no point in having a pager if you can have a cell phone. So I was very upset about having a cell phone and not a pager at the time.
That's really funny. Eric?
Yeah, well, I remember it was 1998. I was not 14 or 15, dating myself. And I think it was an Ericsson, maybe with one of those pull-out antennas and a little, half flip.
Mm-hmm. I think I had one of those.
So I don't know if there are any Breaking Bad fans out there in the audience, but my first phone was the same brand model used by Jesse Pinkman.
Yeah, I had a Sony Ericsson on Singular Wireless. I thought it was pretty slick. I was ridiculed because it wasn't a clamshell. So, I still think it was cool.
Well, I'm impressed that everybody remembers that. All right, so what app, I feel like we ask this one a lot, but we have to. We're at Mobile World Congress. What app can you not live without?
Okay, I'm a Poshmark fanatic.
Shopper.
Yes, buy and sell lots of things all day, every day, and I just absolutely could not live without that app. It's amazing, and I discovered it only a few weeks ago, so
so it's a late adopter.
Yeah,
Very
I'm
good.
a late adopter, but yeah, I can't live without it now.
Eric?
Mine's very utilitarian. It's maps. I have a long commute. I consult it every day for traffic.
I'm not sure. I think it'd be whatever app my girlfriend tells me.
Good answer. Go ahead, Alex.
Mine is Philips Hue. It is connected to my light bulbs, which is really great when you get in bed and forgot to turn off all of the lights. You can,
Like the clapper?
Yeah, basically. Yeah, it's a life changer, and I certainly suggest you all get it. Mine wins.
That's amazing. Definitely going to put that on my list. All right. So, okay, and then we'll wrap up with this question. Obviously, we've seen a lot of great things today, and I would love to know what 5G IoT related device or application that you're most excited about and why.
I guess I'm gonna have to say autonomous vehicles. I recently moved and I once had a very, very long commute to work, and it would have been nice to be able to do something else during that commute rather than just get angry about traffic. And I mean, it also kind of gives me an opportunity to speak briefly about Chairman Thune's bill, the AV START Act, which we hope to continue moving forward in Congress. That would really kind of remove some of the barriers and kind of spur deployment on autonomous vehicles. So I'm excited for that.
Well, I still have a long commute like Eric, so me too. Eric, what do you say?
I'm not sure I'm visionary or creative enough to envision it. And if I was, I wouldn't tell you all. I'd be out starting a startup or something like that. But so I'll take maybe the cheap way out, but it's sincere. It's the things that we can't think of that are going to change the way we live. If you just go back like 10 years ago and think about where we are today, I think there are lots of unexpected things that have come out of the ecosystem. So I look forward to that.
I have to concur with Crystal. I think autonomous vehicles really are going to be an exciting future for the promise of 5G. The House Energy and Commerce Committee last year passed the Self-Drive Act, which passed the full House. And I know the Senate is working on its own version, and we're trying to iron out differences between the two. But when you think about enhanced mobile broadband and massive machine-to-machine communication, AV is really stands out as a promising technology.
Yeah, Eric stole my answer. So no, I'm going to say smart grocery stores. So I leave, much like Meredith, my wallet at home a lot, and it would be nice to walk in, walk out, no transaction, and be done.
I'm looking forward to all of those as well. I just want to thank the panelists for being here today. Again, I know you guys are all very busy. We've heard everything you're working on. We look forward, to continuing to see what you guys do and your bosses do in Congress, and really appreciate your leadership. So, thank you for being here.